this slightly challenging topic that we will discuss today, that is going to be held in the frame of the project of the Central European Academy, which is one of the reasons why our working language will be English. The other one is that we're looking to be open to the Erasmus students. Part of them are here, so we will communicate in English even though all the lecturers are Croatians. Our workshop will be expedient, as you see, and rather short. We started sharp at 11 o'clock, which already indicates the good start of work. The reason why we choose this topic, the ratio of this topic, is that the symbols are, well, obviously a very important part of our life. You can see the soccer celebration the last few days that were very much involved with the symbols. But the use of symbols is much more serious. The symbols are usually kind of neglected, I would say, in law, a part of excessive moments that are very exposed in, as you know, in Croatian legal system. It's the hate speech, the question of national hatred, and so on, which is partly connected with the history of our environment. But the whole complex of symbols is much more. The whole issue of symbols is much more complex. They anyway collected. They anyway indicate identity. They are connected with identification in various groups. Especially in our region, it is mostly connected with the identification of religion and nation. Which makes a very commitment related to that, which makes it not completely rational, in fact, it's not rational at all, and it's very challenging, it's a task of law to rationally operate with this potential source of conflicts. And the conflict resolution. At the same time, what you can spot in the Croatian legal system, that some of these issues are well regulated, they are very extensively regulated because of this usually historical and social reasons, but some others are not. Even though they make a very important part of our lives and lives of society. For example, religious symbols are mostly absent from the regulation. So this all, I would say, is quite a challenging topic that was not enough present, I would say, in discussions apart of the matter of hate speech that was quite extensively discussed and that gave probably most of the needed answers, and that is turned into perhaps political rather than a personal issue rather than a legal issue anymore. At the same time, some other empty spaces or explanations for them are, I would say, pretty much of a challenge to the law. So, we will not give answers to all of that. We will not discuss the whole topics, which is impossible. The conference would be needed for that. We would certainly need an interdisciplinary conference with participation of historians and sociologists especially. It's a very important sociological topic. But we chose rather to concentrate on the essence, because we are lawyers and the law faculty, on the essence of it in the regard to the legal regulation. And we invited the colleagues that are dealing with that, that are, I would say, experts in the field, to check what are the attitudes and what are the questions and potential answers to all these issues. So I will first present colleague Gadašević, Dr. Gadašević, from the chair of the constitutional law, that will speak us about the constitutional public use of the symbols, the constitutional here.
Okay, I thank very much to Professor Cepulo for his kind invitation to this roundtable. This is the
the type of events that I most like, and I have, of course, prepared my overview based on the paper that Professor Cepulo gave you in advance. An excellent paper, I must say, quite comprehensive and very inspiring. In line with that, I would like to point that I'm going to present personally my view through the lens of the general theory of constitution or similar tools, but I would just rather like to point to some specific topics that emerge from the paper of Professor Cepulo and hopefully provoke a discussion and further elaboration in the continuation of this day. So thanks again for your kind invitation, and I am looking forward for your questions. What is the basis of the paper of Professor Cepulo, as I understood it? It's the issue of public display of state symbols and its connection or relationship to national symbols. What emerges is the problem of whether there is a interconnection in the legal sense of the word, constitutionally speaking, or not. So what should be done? It seems that the core of the paper of Professor Cepulo actually is contained in the middle of his paper. Actually, it's page 17. It's not the middle, it's towards the end. As I understood it, he says that overall it seems that the establishment of the Croatian nation state has not resulted with the advanced legal protection of the principal national symbols as could have been expected, but on the contrary, in a kind of sustainability and regulation of certain sensible issues of such provenance. Thus, the discourse on the regulation of the Croatian national symbols is primarily the discourse on the lack of the regulation, and some of the interrelated reasons for that might be a sedating effect of the formation of the Croatian state as the protector of national values. I couldn't agree more with that. This is the conclusion that I find quite persuasive as well. And I think that this might serve as a good basis for further discussion in theoretical terms as well. Now, there is a difference between national symbols and state symbols, as much as there is a difference between the concept of the second characteristics which Professor Cepulo pursues in his paper, and that's the distinction, I think, the basic distinction between the ethnos and demos concept of the population. If there is a difference, and there obviously is, if there is a divergence in regulation between those two concepts, the only solution that I can propose or suggest, amend the Constitution. Okay? So if there is a lack of regulation of certain, I'd say, national symbols, amend the Constitution. That exists. There are constitutions which favor more regulated concepts of national symbols or ethnic characteristics, or whatever you might call them. Go, for instance, to Norway, or go, for instance, to Germany. You will find references to some of these features that Professor Cepulo points out in his paper embedded in the Constitution. This is just my claim, and I would very much like to further elaborate and hear on that as well. Now, what Professor Cepulo points out as paradigms of state symbols is the coat of arms, flag, anthem. Okay, I would agree more with that, of course. He also points to some practices and regulation regarding those symbols, and, if I understood it correctly, reveals the problems related to that. But more or less, I think that those issues are not only covered but solved in the Croatian statute. There's no so much problems with it, outside of the possible discourse on hate speech, which we said won't cover today in this session, in this round table, but that's another story. So, coat of arms, flag, anthem, I don't find these topics quite provocative anymore in Croatia. But as I said, the basic underlying problem from which all other things emerge might be this division between two possible concepts of the definition of populace. One is the demos concept, which is usually, conventionally understood as the concept that emerged in some parts of the Western Europe, principally France. And on the other hand, the concept of ethnocultural political community, which emerged on the eastern part of the European continent, primarily Germany. That is the conventional wisdom as I understood it and as I read about it a long time ago. It also seems that Croatia, according to Professor Cepulo, would belong to that circle which is influenced primarily by the German experience. I'm not an expert in sociology, philosophy, ethnic studies, nationalism, or certain similar disciplines. And this is certainly not the discussion that I would be an expert into, but I never really found that to be a very convincing distinction between two concepts. As far as you go, at least to France and Germany, it's rather a mixture of both of these concepts. More that today, okay? You can clearly see that in the Croatian constitution, and my claim, I mean, in the paper that I wrote beforehand, Professor Cepulo quoted it, together with a Slovenian colleague, Dalibor, is that it is evident that in the Croatian constitution there exist two concepts of of sovereignty, actually. And this is not just my approach, this is the approach that constitutional lawyers of this faculty teach students and so on and so forth. And it's derived from the Constitution. Nobody can deny that there is the concept of national sovereignty, which is clearly defined in the preamble to the Constitution, which establishes Croatia as the nation-state of the Croatian people, as well as its national minorities. On the other hand, of course, Article 1 of the Constitution establishes and defines the concept of popular sovereignty, understood as a concept of demos, so citizens. And this is the dialectics that is of central interest in constitutional terms here. Now, what defines those two concepts? Professor Cepulo clearly wrote in the paper, that there are some constitutive, I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, elements of the national identity, which we can find in the Croatian example. So these are the Croatian language, Latin script, affiliation to Western civilization, Christianity or Catholicism, even more precisely, millennial culture, tradition of the statehood. Okay, I'm quite fine. We can talk about that. I'm not an expert in any of these elements, I would say, but we can further elaborate in the discussion on what these elements that constitute the nation are. And as far as I understood, you took it from Professor Cepulo from philosophy, effective philosophy. Nobody can deny, for instance, that Catholicism is a constitutive element of the Croatian nation. One of Latin script, millennial culture, excellent. Whether they are distinctive features of the Croatian nation, that's another question. Against some other nations, definitely. Against others, or against them, in relation to others, well, I don't think so. Hungarians, our fellow Hungarians who will watch this round table, or Polish, or French, or Germans, also have millennial culture, affiliation to Catholicism, and so on and so forth. This is not to say that I undermine the importance of these elements. No. I just say that they are different, and now I pass to the other side of the story, that they are different from what we have within the concept of constitutional identity as it's understood within the concept of demos and within the concept of the Constitution itself. So, what are the constitutive elements of the constitutional identity in Croatia? I mean, apart from the concept of demos, constitutions do not operate with millennial culture or affiliation to this or that religion. These are the elements of the constitutional identity that might be as human rights. But constitutive elements of the constitutional identity are twofold, at least, in the modern age. And I'm talking about the period after the great revolutions of the late 18th century, primarily, of course, French and American. Separation of powers, human rights. Human rights as a concept that developed towards the idea of fundamental rights. Many do not understand the difference between human rights, basic rights, fundamental rights, and such. There is a difference, that's another story. But fundamental rights, or human rights, you may even call them that, and separation of powers are two distinctive features of constitutionalism. It's not about majority just, it's also about protection of rights. Which rights? Universal rights. Generally applicable rights. Applicable to all. Because modern societies are societies, communities in which plurality must be respected, based on the fact that there is a different party. Okay, so again, if there is a divergence in these two concepts in practice, I personally don't have a problem with putting more of the national identity features into the constitutional law. But that needs some process of revision of the constitution, which is possible. Even in Croatia, I'll come back to some examples later on, and I won't be long. I'll just give a few more hints on what I have to say. So, take for instance the development of human rights. Human rights started in the modern age with the revolutions, as I said, bourgeois revolutions. Okay, 1789 in France, 1776 in America, largely then fueled by the adoption of the Constitution in 1787 and the Bill of Rights in 1791. On the western part, also Germany, which started its constitutional, I would say, modern path after the Second World War with 1949 Constitution. But what these documents tell us? They tell us, and this is my claim, of course, open to argument, is that they are a mixture of various influences. This is not my claim, actually. I read it in the commentaries of the German Constitution. Okay. German Constitution, for instance, was drafted in the aftermath of the Second World War. Its purpose is well known. Prevention of the re-establishment of totalitarian regime. But more than that, it established the Bill of Rights, for instance. Not just universal Bill of Rights applicable to not just German people, but also to everybody. It is the influence of various social groups. Leftists, rightists, liberals, conservativists, and so on and so forth. Human dignity is a typical example. It is said in the commentaries of the community that actually human dignity was drafted on the appeal or influence of the Christian Democrats. Excellent. Who wouldn't agree that there is a human dignity as the basic value? Human dignity, however, has multiple meanings as well. Okay? It's not just one unique meaning of human dignity. But it's also social state, which was the influence of the left in Germany after the Second World War. French example starts with the individual approach of the Declaration of 1789, with the emphasis on the separation of powers, but also with the emphasis on individual rights. It is always said that 1789 Declaration represents the liberal view of society, liberal. Not communitarian, liberal, individual. That was largely not revised, but what was added was other values in the French constitutional scheme, also after the Second World War. 1946, preamble to the Constitution of 1946 established some very important social rights, which remained in the Constitution of France until today. So the idea is that there is always pluralism as the normative idea that I would support, difference of interests, and that this is best protected within the concept of demos. Not denying, by no means, that exists the idea of a nation state. Okay, Croatia is a nation state of the Croatian people. I mean, that's clear. That was not even defined in 1990, as Professor Cepulo correctly pointed out. It was already recognized before, and it didn't have to be recognized before because we do have a history from the 7th century, whatever, more or less continuous, burdensome, but continuous, which proves that Croatian nation existed, and wanted its state. Now, just two points on where I see in the case law this mixture of, I wouldn't say interests, but elements between constitutional identity as such and ethnic or national identity on the other hand. Church, religion, religious communities, for instance. It is not that it's not, I mean, it could be more regulated maybe, I don't know. But what may be the basis for further elaboration and analysis is also, I mean, well-known themes of the following. International treaties. We all know that religious communities, especially the Catholic Church in Croatia, is regulated especially through international treaties with the Holy See. So, and that is also the constitutional court practice related to that, which through actually its great self-deference in judicial self-restraint left those questions outside of the scope of judicial review. So, in a way, the Constitutional Court there goes as the one which does not involve in political processes or in reviewing the substance of international treaties and so on. That's another story. But that is the proof that religion as such does have an impact in constitutional terms, in a way that even without possible lack of regulation of certain issues, that exists the constitutional response to some relationships. Marriage referendum. I mean, marriage referendum from 2013 is an excellent example for many things. Primarily for development of the Constitutional Court case law. And I have elsewhere argued that actually the intervention of the Constitutional Court in the marriage referendum was not actually provoked by the concern of the Constitutional Court to, pronounce itself on whether the marriage was possible to be defined in the Constitution. Now, the Constitutional Court actually did that because it wanted to improve its own position towards the Parliament. That's another story. But the marriage referendum passed. Now, we do have a specific definition of marriage in the Croatian Constitution. And this is an example of what I have tried to point at the beginning. Certain elements of national identity or elements of Croatian nation as the ethno-cultural community may be put into the Constitution by amending the Constitution. That was the case. For the time being, I leave the question whether this is acceptable constitutionally or not. I mean, the Constitutional Court said actually that it is. Many people are wrong in saying that the Constitutional Court did not pronounce itself. It did. Formally, didn't have the right to involve in the case, but it did. Okay, but this was the example of how certain elements could go into the substance of the Constitution. The third example that I will mention, and we could later on talk about that as well, if you wish, is the case that was delivered by the court, decided by the court several years ago, concerning the presidential oath, the oath of the President of the Republic, the person which takes over the office of the President of the Republic. I don't know, probably many of you know what the issue there was. The final words of the presidential oath contained the words, "So help me God." That came before the Constitutional Court, and the court said there is no problem with that. Okay, so that does not offend the religious affiliation of the person holding the office, neither it forces that person to adopt a certain religion. I won't go into detail. I disagree with that. There is no reason for that to do that. In terms of the laws on the separation of church and state, there is no reason for that. What concerns me actually is the lack of explanation by the court. What the court did there was saying there is no problem with that. Okay, I know that there are experts, and Frane will probably intervene with that. Please do. There are always divergent opinions on certain issues, and this is what we do at the faculty at the university. This is what we have the open discussion around. I do stick with the dissenting opinion in that case, but let's leave that for later on. Minorities, that's my second example, if I may 2-3 minutes more. Minorities is a good example of these pictures. 3 cases. The underlying point is that there were responses from the Constitutional Court. 2011 case related to the amendments to the electoral law and the law on national minorities, constitutional law and rights of members of national minorities, which gave extensive or revised voting rights to minorities, most notably the double voting rights to certain minorities. And then this was struck down by the Constitutional Court. It's very good reasoning. What the court did there was, it said that could be the case to adopt double voting rights as the affirmative action for national minorities in certain cases where this is proportional, but we don't have that in Croatia. Not anymore. No problems with minorities. That would require double voting rights. The court applied proportionality, legitimate interest, said various things, and then decided that it was wrong, that it was unconstitutional. Couldn't agree more. What a good decision of the court. Secondly, 2014, the popular referendum initiative on the amending the constitutional law on rights of national minorities in order to revise the rules for public use of scripts and language of national minorities in law. Okay. Instead of 1/3, 1/half of the minority should be present at the territory of the law community to be able to activate its own right to use national language and script. The court struck it down. Said this is unconstitutional. It does not have a legitimate interest. It's not proportional. In a way that the court then not only said that through a very detailed analysis, very persuasive and very technically, I would say, worked out. It also gave some very important pronouncements related to the issue of identity as well. The court said you could go against the language as such, which, including the languages of national minorities, make part of the Croatian constitutional identity. Language is a concept which has enormous, universal, general, cultural value, and shouldn't be attacked for political reasons. Now, this is for national minorities. Finally, there is one example that I will leave out for the present opening remarks because of the lack of space and time, not space but time. This is the popular referendum initiative in 2018, which sought to amend the constitution in order to prevent the national minorities representatives in the parliament to vote on 2 crucial issues. The first one is the adoption of the state budget, and the second one is the vote in confidence of the government. That didn't go to the court because the parliament Previously decided there was no enough collected signatures, but I have elsewhere written an article on what could have been the outcome had that case come before the Constitutional Court. And I strongly believe that this would be also struck down by the court for a number of reasons. But these questions do emerge from time to time, and basically to come back to what I said at the beginning, maybe I find that very persuasive. This is the final conclusion for this part of the discussion. What Professor Cepulo said, that the basic reason for collecting further regulation of certain elements of national identity integration context is connected to the fact that that is the Croatian state as such. This is the basis, okay, which combines these elements. It's understood that the majority of the people will respect and preserve those elements of the national identity. They're not in jeopardy anymore. We're not in some federation, which was probably a problem, generally seen as the obstacle to the full realization of national identity claims. However, there emerges another question, and this is the question for the future, not only in terms of national distinctions, but also in terms of constitutional distinctions. And that's, of course, our membership in the European Union. And I was very surprised the other day when I spoke to another colleague who did not understand that what we witnessed the other day related to the training of the Ukrainian soldiers and the process of decision-making in the Croatian parliament was actually an example of constitutional identity of decision-making in Croatia. Because we had to decide on that issue for ourselves in the parliament, despite the fact that the previous decision was made in the European Union. These are the questions that I leave for the future and probably for some discussion. Thanks for your time. Maybe I have extended my time frame. I apologize for that.
Thank you to Professor Gardashev. This was an excellent, I would say, introduction and very challenging, pinpointing to the very important, I could hardly imagine better beginning of this panel, except the timing, I say, but considering that I was very short with my introduction at the beginning, we could tolerate it, especially considering the fact that the quality of his explanation. So the next speaker will be our colleague Macharelski from the chair of criminal law, who will speak about criminal law aspects of the regulation of symbols in the Croatian legal system. He is sick, but not so sick not to participate at our panel, so he will address us from the home. Professor Macharelski, please, the floor, if I may say so, is yours.
Hello everyone, I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
So some of you will probably know me will recognize my voice as I have this sore throat. It's not COVID, fortunately, but unfortunately I'm not able to attend because
Colleague Macharelski, unfortunately, you should be, I do not know whether we have a possibility to fix it. The loudness is a problem.
No, I should talk louder.
Yes, we are 100% already, but I guess it
Okay,
can be.
I will try to yell.
Great,
That's-
great.
Although my voice is a bit, I have a sore throat, so I will try to speak very loud. Do you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear this time. Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I'm grateful to Professor Cepulo for this opportunity to present at this conference. I was also really thrilled and honored to read and comment his paper. We had a great lunch together discussing this very interesting topics, and especially in the Croatian context. For some of you, my presentation will be very basic because I'm aware that our colleagues from Hungary want to learn some very basic things about our Croatian legal systems. So I will talk about the criminal law aspects of the regulation of symbols in Croatian legal system. So I will start with damaging the reputation of the Republic of Croatia, which is a very basic criminal offense listed in the chapter of the Criminal Code that deals crimes against the Croatian state. In Article 349, it reads, whoever exposes the Republic of Croatia, its flag, coat of arms, or national anthem to public ridicule, contempt, or gross disparagement shall be punished by imprisonment not exceeding 1 year. I should say that these offenses, generally offenses against the Croatian state, are fortunately very rare. In practice, in the judicial practice, this offense is often known in the media that is sometimes committed abroad, so outside of Croatia. Croatia has jurisdiction to prosecute these offenses even when they are committed outside of Croatia. However, it is in practice very, of course, difficult and probably incurs some costs that are not very rational to spend, as these defendants would never appear in Croatia. And the best example is a convicted war criminal, Vojislav Šešelj, who was on several occasions burning the Croatian flag. So he committed this crime, however, he was never prosecuted for that. He was, to my knowledge, prosecuted on some occasion for another criminal offense in Serbia where he committed this crime, and we have a similar crime that protects also other countries, so their national symbols. So in Article 356, whoever exposes a foreign state, its flag, coat of arms, or national anthem to public ridicule, contempt, or gross disparagement shall be punished by imprisonment not exceeding 1 year. So as you can see, the Croatian Criminal Code equally provides an equal punishment for those who damage the reputation of the Croatian national symbols or of any other foreign or international organization. Symbols like UN, the European Union, and others are also included in this criminal offense. I cannot talk about this topic without mentioning hate crime and hate speech, as these criminal offenses are the ones offenses that offend national, so that also not just the minorities, but also the Croatian majority. So when we talk about hate crime, which is defined in Article 87 of the Criminal Code, it is any criminal offense committed on the account of a person's race, color, religion, national or ethnic origin, disability, gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity. So national and ethnic origin are particularly, and religion are particularly particular kind of characteristics of these offenses. I should say that in the research that I was involved in, we found that actually Croats are the second the most victimized persons by this offense. So it's not just, as I said, minorities, but the most frequent victims are Serbs, but Croats are actually the second most victimized. And you know, if we wouldn't have a special offense that would address national symbols, as I mentioned before, this crime would be prosecuted as hate crime. So this would be a damaging of somebody's property, for example, if it's somebody's flag, and it could be theoretically prosecuted as hate crime. And
for the symbolic meaning. It could be also prosecuted as hate speech, but there are some requirements that need to be met. So whoever in print, through radio, television, computer system, network, or in any other way publicly incites or makes available in the public tracks, pictures, or other material instigating violence of hatred. So this is very important. They have to be instigating violence or hatred against a group of persons, and there are listed characteristics including religion, national or ethnic origin, shall be imprisoned by not exceeding 3 years. So this criminal offense is the basic hate speech offense in Croatian criminal law. It's mainly applied to protect minorities, but actually it's very rarely applied in practice because it's difficult to prove that individuals have the intent to instigate violence or hatred against a particular group. Sometimes they're just doing it out of some extreme patriotic, let's say, reasons, but not necessarily on the account of the minorities. In any case, the main problem in Croatia actually is not the criminal law legislation, but the misdemeanor law legislation. So currently in Croatia, there is no clear distinction of what is permitted, what is not in relation to the Croatian independent state of Croatia, the Croatian puppet states of the Nazi period. So here you see 4 symbols, and not many ordinary people will know actually what is legitimate, what is allowed, what is not. I actually did some trainings for the Croatian police, and currently they are quite confused because of this situation. So as I wrote, the devil is in the details, so actually the first flag is the one that is clearly prohibited, as is the accurate flag of the independent state of Croatia. But the others are not. And the last one, which also has contains the controversial salute for homeland ready, which was saluted, and now we're talking about football by our Croatian football player Joe Šimonić, who was charged for a misdemeanor because he saluted that on a football game, and he even appealed to the European Court of Human Rights, where his case was dismissed because it was a margin of appreciation of Croatia to prosecute these offenses. On the other hand, there are other also cases of the European Court of Human Rights. Our colleagues from Hungary will know about the Faber versus Hungary case, which involved the use of Arpad flag, which was also used in the Nazi period. And the European Court of Human Rights, since it was an also old flag, it was allowed to be used. It was not fair to prosecute this individual for a misdemeanor because this is a historical flag, and it fell under the freedom of expression under Article 10 of the European Court of the Convention of Human Rights. In any case, we should think about not about criminalizing. Not about addressing these problems, these social problems, by just using criminal law against it. We should generally talk about confrontation with the past and the past symbols. I always am surprised that we still have in this small county of Jelenovac this coat of arms which depicts a cut-off head of a Turk, which shows that we have not finished the confrontation with the wars we had with the Ottoman Empire, let alone these most recent wars. So the conclusion is that the criminal law regulation should be the ultima ratio of protection of symbols. I think in this aspect, Croatian law is very sound. the misdemeanor legislation needs to be amended. It should be more clear. You know, some of these symbols of the former Nazi period of Croatia are prohibited, clearly, explicitly prohibited in other countries such as in Austria, but not in Croatia, so people don't know what they are actually allowed to use and not what are not. Even the UEFA, I know I read earlier about the guidelines for football matches. UEFA prohibited and printed guidelines for football fans, which symbols are prohibited. And I think this is an important issue that we need to address in our future, and generally to confront the issues with the past symbol. This is something the US is doing nowadays with their political leaders from the era when they had slavery. So the people who essentially supported slavery in the past, and persecution of Native Americans. So they are now removing their statues. So this is not something that we would be unique. Actually, U.S., which is very proud of its First Amendment of the Constitution, with a lot of freedom of speech in their society, is doing a lot to confront their past, and this is something we need to do to foster reconciliation with our minorities and also with other nations around us. Thank you for your attention. And I hope you were able to hear me.
Thank you to Professor Noszewski, including very good timing of his lecture, and also because of on instructing us about the criminal law aspects of the regulation, which are most, I would not say just most controversial, but also most directly present in the interference into ordinary life of the citizens. So next paper is by Henry T. Cohen from the law, Chair of Roman Law, that was going to speak about cultural goods as national symbols and its historical and normative context in Croatia.
Thank you very much, Professor Cepulo, also for inviting me and including me in this valuable and interesting workshop. Basically, my theme is cultural goods as national symbols in a sort of historical normative context, so it is a bit something different from the preceding lecture, but it is an issue that I have dealt with to an extent previously, so this is what I wanted to contribute. Basically, what is the issue? The issue is whether cultural goods could or should be considered national symbols, or even if they are considered, should this be in a national sense, national meaning in an ethnic sense or a civic sense. And basically, I have a normative framework in Croatia considered in a historical context, which I think is in this particular subject crucial for the understanding of the whole issue. So basically, we start from Constitution, as in all legal areas, and I think that one article that hints to relevance and importance of cultural goods is Article 52, that states that cultural goods, basically, or cultural items, generally, can be of interest to the Republic of Croatia. So it's a sort of paramount national interest, along with some other items and elements associated with state or a nation. Also, another article that is important, I would say perhaps even more important, is Article 68, which states that the state shall protect scientific, cultural, and artistic assets as national spiritual values. So this is also, I think, even more important than the previous statement, because in this statement we have this association with spiritual, national spiritual values, which obviously hints, at least I would say, to this ethnic aspect of the whole story. And then comes the crucial point on the level of the Act on Protection and Preservation of Cultural Goods, which, so basically we can speak about cultural goods generally, having national importance, but there is also a particular category, cultural goods of national importance. So this is a sort of higher category within cultural goods, and cultural goods which have the greatest national importance for the Republic of Croatia are inscribed in a separate part of the register of cultural goods. So the act itself recognizes this national importance. But what does this national importance mean is the central problem. So first, regarding this historical perspective, basically the problem is, was this national element present when the protection of cultural goods was developed in Croatia, or at least in historical Croatian parts? Speaking about the history of the protection of cultural goods generally, usually historians associate this protection, of course, it is not surprising, with Catholic Church, because it was for a long time sponsor of art and artistic over the whole world. So already from the 15th century we have legislation, canonic legislation dealing with the problem of limiting export of cultural goods and art from the Papal States. So we can see that in the beginning of the protection of cultural goods, we have the same issue that exists today on the level of European Union, because the basic problem in the EU legislation, as we will see later on, is the problem of export and import of cultural goods. So this existed in the beginning. We also have some other examples. Most important, I believe, this so-called first law that comprehensively dealt with the issue, the so-called Lex Paca from 1820, which was an extensive legislation within the Papal States in Rome that dealt with the problems of protection of cultural goods, protection of architectural sites, and so on. But in a more modern sense, if we consider this in a more modern, contemporary sense, I would say that basically protection of cultural goods stems from the 19th century. And that is interesting in our present context, because the 19th century is also century, at least in Europe, the century of, let's say, romantic national springs and formation and reformation of many major European states, such as, for example, Italy, which was formed in the 19th century as a complete state, Germany or Prussia, France also sort of established its power in the period. So parallelly with this situation, we have protection of national goods, and it did have national overtones, let's say, because, for example, in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, an important issue was the return of art from Italy that was taken by the French and taken back to France. So this issue also existed in the 19th century. And also we have, of course, countries with rich cultural heritage, such as Greece, which was one of the first to try to protect its cultural heritage. So it was the first, besides this law in the Papal States, the first to bring a comprehensive legislation in this regard. There is a list of countries that followed later on. So where is Croatia? Oh, before we come to Croatia, parallel with this development, which was, let's say, sort of infused with national element, ethnic, let's say, we have parallel development on international level. So another issue relevant for cultural goods was the issue of protection of cultural goods during conflict, especially in the 19th and 20th century, when we have this concept of total war, when during war, as you can see right now in the global situation, during war, of course, besides of civilian casualties, which is a much more important issue, we also have the problem of the devastation of cultural goods on a large scale. So this issue was recognized in the 19th century, and so in general conventions dealing with general problems of international humanitarian law, we also have this issue of cultural goods. And in the 20th century, especially after the Second World War, we have more and more international conventions specifically dedicated to protection of cultural goods. So in this instance, we have an approach which is completely universal. It is not concentrated on this national, ethnic component of the whole story, but on an international, universal approach to the protection of cultural goods. And now we come to the Croatian situation. Now, the 19th century for Croatia was a fairly complex situation, as Professor Cepulo will be the first to know here in this classroom. And of course, this was all reflected in this area. Basically, the political situation in Habsburg monarchy was fairly complex, and this was reflected in the area of protection of cultural goods. What is important for our present discussion is the fact that the Habsburg monarchy followed the general European trends that existed, for example, in France, or in Germany. So it wanted to protect its cultural goods, but the protection could not be based on this ethnic national moment because this was a multinational state. And we have, from the middle of the 19th century is important because that was the moment when institutional protection started. Kaiserliche Königliche Zentralkommission für Erforschung und Erhaltung der Baudenkmale was instituted, and the first president of this institute actually associated protection of cultural goods with this multicultural Habsburg state, Greater Austrian state, let's say. He actually said that protection of cultural goods is important because we have to connect the German part of our state and Slavic part, east and west and so on. So interestingly, in Austria, the moment was again universal. It was not ethnic, let's say, in the protection of cultural goods. Specifically within Croatian parts, or what is today contemporary Croatia, from the beginning of the 19th century, because that was the period when certain parts of Croatia with rich cultural history, the coastal parts, were integrated into Habsburg monarchy. So already from the beginning of the 19th century, there are incentives to create inventories and lists, and some famous Croatian intellectuals are nominated as conservators. For example, Luka Garanin, Karol Lanz, and so on. And then from the middle of the 19th century, we have sort of spilling over of institutional protection in Vienna. So we have first conservator for Dalmatia was Vitko-Andrićin Split. This was the commission first for Diocletian's Palace and then later on commission for Dalmatia. And in Zagreb we have commission, then later Land Commission, which was led by Ivan Kukuljević Sakcinski. And generally, this happened on an institutional level, but on the level of intellectual bourgeoisie, which was strong in Zagreb at the time, we do have this sort of drive towards protecting national heritage and clear association with this ethnic national element. There are strong national overtones. I have an example from the newspapers of the time. The newspaper, which was sort of national newspaper, Novine Dalmatinsko-Hrvatsko-Slavonske, and Ivan Filipović Kopačan in the middle of the 19th century says, the picture is from the newspaper, but in Croatian, of course, but basically, first he recognized the problem of the export of cultural goods in Croatia, again the problem that is at the core of the protection of cultural goods today. And also he associated protection of cultural goods with sort of national pride, with connection with our ancestors, and also sort of something good to do to preserve for the future generations. So I think this indicates clear association with this national ethnic element, but of course at the time this was more Slavic and Illyrian in nature. There was no terminological association with Croatia as yet because that was the situation at the time. He also says that people who does not respect your own culture does not respect itself, and so on and so on. Very dramatic in its expressions. And this dramatic expressions obviously led to the initiative of the Croatian parliament, which instigated creating of this association, which was dedicated to the issue, the so-called Društvo za jugoslavensku povjesnicu i starine. And interestingly, also, I would say, in approving the statute of this association, of course, the statute had to be approved by the Interior Ministry and by the Emperor himself. And in this approval, the Interior Minister Bach, very famous Interior Minister, suggested to the Emperor that the statute of the society should be accepted, but nationalistic references should be excluded. So he said the term "our people" should be left out, references to the Triune Kingdom of Croatia, Slavonia, and Dalmatia should be left out, and also he said that there should be not too many regional branches because they have national, that is his expression, of course in German, nationalistic tendencies. However, even in the meantime, before the statute was approved, and then after it was approved, this association was very active. And in its activities, it also had this sort of national approach. Another proof of this comes from another paper which was dedicated to these cultural issues, Archiv za povjesnicu Jugoslavensku. Again, Sakcinski, who was in charge of the whole society, again has clear references to main problems. The problem was again export of cultural goods. and also clear references to sort of rich cultural heritage of the trio kingdoms, so of the whole Croatia, Slavonia, and Dalmatia, although they were in different administrative parts of the state, and so on. So this sort of, I think, proves the whole national angle. And of course, as it might be expected, throughout the turbulent first half of the 20th century, because this part was turbulent in political sense, so it was also turbulent in this part. But we have sort of continuation of this idea throughout the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and then, of course, in the independent state of Croatia, the fascist state, we have clear association of cultural goods with national interest, with national identity of the Croatian state. One example that I think is well known is the example of the exchange of the Croatian authorities in order to get the famous baptistery of Viseslav from Italy in exchange for 2 paintings of Italian painters. This was a cultural item, obviously, and also an important national symbol. It is considered to be a national symbol even today. In socialist Yugoslavia, of course, the approach is not ethnic nationalistic because it is a multinational state. The approach is generally universal, but still concentrated on protection. So this was important for socialist authorities, but on a multicultural, multinational level, we have new laws, new acts, and basically the contemporary legislation is built on this socialist Yugoslav situation. Now to go to contemporary perspective, basically our act, which was mentioned in the beginning, is infused with the international legislation on the matter and EU legislation. I have a list, of course, not everything is important, but list of international conventions that have been, with which our act is complied with. Also EU law, we have 1 directive and 2 council regulations concentrated on the issue of transport and export and import and so on. And we can ask ourselves whether this national element exists in this aspect, so this aspect that is dedicated to this international and EU law. Basically, national element does exist, but in a sort of technical sense, because references to national in international conventions means something different than international. Also in the context of EU law, reference to national element is a reference to something different than EU level. So we have EU jurisdiction, we have national jurisdiction. Also international conventions, we have jurisdiction of the United Nations or of UNESCO, and then we have jurisdiction of Croatia and so on. But there are some references. For example, in the Hague Convention of 1970, reference to events of national importance. So one can wonder, what does this mean, event of national importance? Also in EU law we have the concept of national treasure, but national treasure is basically any cultural good designated as such in another member state. This has been accepted by Croatian law, which has nacionalno blago, or national treasure, in the Act on Protection and Preservation of Cultural Goods. And basically, what might this greatest national importance mean within an act? It might mean that one state declares cultural goods to be of the highest national importance, so more important than regional cultural goods, because we have cultural goods of local or regional importance, then we have another step that is the national importance, as a sort of candidate for the World Heritage List of UNESCO. Regarding criteria of the UNESCO World Heritage List, those criteria are mainly or mostly universal. So there are references to universal human values, but there are also references to cultural areas of the world or cultural traditions. And I suppose that some nations, the large, major nations of the world perhaps, can associate their ethnic identity with the cultural tradition. And in that sense, I think that there will be some coordination. But generally, I would say that criteria are universal, so human, universal, global, and so on. So some specific data regarding cultural goods of national importance in Croatia that we mentioned in the beginning. This is a list of what is on this list, and I think this also might be telling of whether we are speaking about some national importance or not. Within this list, within this register, within this particular list, most items, 27 items out of 42, belong to religious items. And as much as we can associate religious items with national ethnic identity, then we can speak about this national element. But otherwise, I would say that they are mostly religious. There is one Orthodox, so religious item. So this is something associated with the ethnic minority question. Also one example of Ottoman architecture from the 17th century, I think, 6 examples from Greek and Roman antiquity, and 7 fortifications or cities. And the issue may be whether some goods that are of national importance, designated such by the law, whether they are national symbols. I suppose that some of them, and here we have some examples that are on this list, may be considered national symbols. For example, when we see the picture of Dubrovnik city walls, or for example, Trakošćan castle, we can say that we will recognize we are speaking about Croatia, at least in Croatia or in region generally. But I wouldn't say that they are particularly associated with the Croatian ethnic identity, perhaps. I'm not sure. So in conclusion, regarding the first question, could or should cultural goods be considered national symbols? Are they national in an ethnic or civic sense? I would refer this question to the first presentation, because it's actually the same conundrum, the same problem. Because references to the national element in the constitution are the same in the context of the formation of the parliament in Croatia, or in the context of cultural goods. So the constitutional conundrum applies also here. Of course, due to the majority, de facto there is possibility that many national symbols will be included in the list of cultural goods, perhaps even list of cultural goods of national importance, but there is no criteria in a national ethnic sense that would render such goods particularly selectable for this category. And of course, there is also a possibility that there is some bias on an administrative level, or a possibility to intentionally go and include certain important national symbols into the list of nationally important cultural goods, but this has not been as yet recognized in practice. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much to colleague Kjeld, who gave us a very sharp and clear explanation of meaning of the terms national in this narrower, but also in the broader context of Croatia, and present the historical reconstruction that shed the light to it. Also thank him for perfect timing as well. So we are only 10 minutes over, which is very much conventional in such conferences, and we will have a quite short break because there are only 3 papers, and continue with religious and minority issues, quite interesting in the second part of our workshop. So we'll have a break. The coffee will arrive just now. Thank you. Dear colleagues, we can continue with our session and switch to always in this space, always very intriguing, complicated and challenging topic of national minorities and religion. I have the honor to announce Professor Alexander Koles-Grauas from Theoretical Law, who will speak about freedom of religion and religious symbols in the Croatian civil law between proclamation and protection. So,
thank you very much.
Please.
So when I got this task from Professor Cepulo, I was a little bit concerned, because I wasn't quite aware what to talk about, because I asked myself how we protect in civil law religious freedom. And I had to make a research and found out that there is not so much to talk about the lege lata, but we should consider the lege ferenda. And with help of human rights, because freedom of religion is connected to personality rights, and I will try to connect these two topics. We have here many religious symbols, and I chose in this lecture Christian symbols, but of course it can be any of these applicable in such situations. So this is just for the sake liberty and plurality and the spirit of human rights. So we have in the Articles 40 of the Constitution of the Republic of Croatia, freedom and conscience and religion and the freedom to demonstrate religious or other convictions shall be guaranteed. So constitutional lawyers, of course, may argue when, by whom, and how, and any other topics. So, but this is the basis of our debate that should be opened in also other branches. We have the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms with Article 9, well known to everybody, that everyone has the right to freedom of religion and the conscience. And when we talk about religion, it is not just religion, the possibility or to be religious, but also not to be religious. So we have to protect both approaches and both convictions of each of us. And thinking how to make it more close, I chose one Croatian case of Savez Cavaleđi Bota and others versus Croatia. This is freedom of law, family law, because we have agreements with the Holy See and many other religious communities. We will see how many of them a little bit later in this very moment 10 years ago. But some other religious communities that were registered also in the register of religious communities want to have same benefits and same privileges as the other religious communities that were registered, and they are registered as well. So the main the main request was that the government's refusal to conclude an appropriate agreement with them and the resulting inability to provide certain religious services and obtain state recognition of religious marriages conducted by them and reach their right not to be discriminated against in the exercise of the freedom of religion and the rights set forth by the law. What is family law point of view? That if in Croatia, as you know, we here concludes marriage in certain religious communities, but this couple should go before to the marriage register to obtain a marriage certificate that they may marry, and then they may conclude religious marriage in certain religious communities, and then this religious clerk or priest has to provide this certificate to marriage register, and that means that they don't need to go first to conclude civil marriage and then later a religious marriage. And this opportunity was opened up by first agreement, state agreement between the state and the Holy See, and then because of non-discrimination approach, similar agreements have been concluded also to many other religious communities. So all these churches were churches of Reformist denominations, which are registered under Croatian law. They count from 30 to 300 or 80 to 300 members, and they also they're legal persons as well in Croatia. But what has happened that the government issued an instruction in December 2004 And this instruction narrowed possibility to conclude such agreement. These are prerequisites, and these three communities, as was considered by the state, has not fulfilled these requests from this instruction. Also, parallel, we have to point out that there was the obligation set from 2006 that had rights of personality as a norm, that every natural person or legal entity, this is also important, is entitled to protection of its rights of personality, we know it's by prava osobnosti, under the conditions provided by law. And there are also examples of these rights of personality that are not set up as numerous clauses, but they are as examples. So there is no freedom of religion in this set of rights, but it can be derived from the general norm. And also, a legal entity shall have all the above-mentioned rights of personality apart from those related to the biological character of a natural person, and in particular, the right to reputation, and good name, honor, name of company, name, business secrecy, entrepreneurial freedom, etc. So also by example. There is also another norm from this the Obligations Act that contracts have to be fulfilled in the meaning of as well contracts between physical persons and between state and legal personalities as religious communities. In this very case, such contract has not been concluded in that time, and also there is a request to desist from a violation of rights of personality, also very broad norm, and with no notion what should happen later. In the judgment of the European Court, there is a chapter describing theoretical approach to this issue. I discussed a little bit before with our professor of civil law, Professor here, and he told me, oh, I'm very surprised with this chapter, with Sasha, I can say like this, because there is, it is not true. It is not true that there is no consensus, because there is no debate on it. It's a lack also in academical approach, so we don't know what we could expect, how our judges would act, and what judgment would be if something like this would happen. So the European Court said, okay, we are not quite sure what might happen. Also, there has been change of law, and the content of particular norms on the right of personality have been a little bit changed. So there is another questionable situation, and they said so far it is largely disputed. We can see how many religious communities 10 years ago had concluded such an agreement, many of them, but not yet these nominations we just talked about. But the conclusion of the European Court unanimously was that there was a violation of freedom of religion for these religious communities, And very interesting for our topic, similar topic, that each applicant church is entitled to get 9,000 euros in respect of non-pecuniary damage. So in this approach should be applied on national level. That means that also they could sue for non-pecuniary damage also in national proceedings. But in this case, the most important was that there was the discrimination, because some religious communities could conclude this agreement and the other did not. So the principle of non-discrimination helped them to protect their freedom of religion. And I took also another example of some employees in Great Britain, a case from 2013. They wanted to wear, these applicants wanted to wear and wore cross as on the necklace. So the first one was employee of British Airways, and British Airways requested their staff not to wear religious symbols or any other signs of religious devotion. And this lady was seeked for legal protection and succeeded in front of the Human Rights, because they said that such request was against their human rights, against their freedom of religion, and they argued, you can read this argumentation here, it's not to be read. So it was also, she was also awarded by 2,000 euros of non-pecuniary damage. The other applicant did not succeed, because she was a nurse in geriatric home, so she had to take care for sick people. So it was considered that the request not to wear any jewelry like this was reasonable, because it was in favor for the protection of patients. So she did not succeed with her request. There are also other requests in these cases. So there were also more applicants, but I just wanted to show you how freedom of religion could be should have sometimes some borders. Thank you. And it is not absolute. Also, our Constitutional Court of the Republic of Croatia, they intend to give some non-material compensation in some other fields of violation of human rights, but we don't have case law in this area. And also, there is no, as far as I know, case laws on breach of freedom of religion, but we had some disputed situations. As far as I remember, one was explosion of the cross in one of schools, and it did not reach court, this case, but it was discussed through some institutions like ombudsman. And if we compare with case Lauzzi versus Italy, then we maybe could have some analogy to this case, that maybe somehow that it would not violate some religious affiliations, persons' feelings. Another case, as far as I know, was the question about the blessing of bread in schools, because atheistic parents thought that this practice might breach the freedom of non-religion, just to say it like this, or philosophical approach, and the right to raise children according to philosophical values and approach of parents, if their children should compulsorily be present when the priest blesses the bread in public schools. As far as I know, Children's Own Ombudsman was against such practice. So now this practice in different schools is different. If nobody complains, then the priest comes, and if somebody complains, as far as I know, but it is not in scientific research, there is no such religious, in a way, religious ceremony. So we could also discuss about this approach, and I think it would be a good chance to to bring more legal certainty, also in civil law, also in this public area of law, in educational law, and also there was, I also almost forget the cases where some people want to went out from the church because they were Christian and entered into the Christianity, I don't know how to say exactly, registers led by Catholic Church in this case, but there is no such, as far as I know, provision in canon law when somebody is entered into the Christian register. There is no way how to be erased from these books, because you can express freely that you are not member of Catholic religion when you have a chance to express this privately or openly, but there is no way to erase this data from books. I only found out in the Ombudsman report that these problems have been solved, but how it is not known to scientific or academic. So, if somebody is interested, also there was very new, fresh case in United States, because a Muslim was entered into the no-fly list, and he got non-pecuniary damage because he managed to sue the agent, not the institution, but personally the agent. But this case is more complex, and we don't have time to explain this. It's a mixture of belonging to Muslim minority as a religion, or belonging to Muslim minority as cultural heritage as well. So maybe this case also less open more discussion how to solve these future problems in Croatian law. 20 minutes and 53 seconds.
Great.
Thank you very much, and I'm open to
report about judicial practice and open up to the question of the legislative policy or the legislative politics. And now we have our colleague Andres Kanicic from the chair of administrative law, with the paper Legal Regulation of Symbols of National Minorities and Religious Symbols in the Croatian Legal System, from strict regulation to absence of regulation. These two topics, national minorities and religious symbols, are not associated together because they are quite frequently associated together in our practice, but also because they belong to the so to say community part of the society. The largest part of this workshop was dedicated to the so to say mainstream of the national framework, and and the community that is parts of the broader society, that is national minorities and religious communities with religious symbols. So please.
Thank you, Professor Cepulo, and thank you for inviting me to this interesting workshop. So, this topic I will speak about is somewhat delicate, as it is linked with several elements which make it so: politics, emotions, and subjectiveness. Because the use of symbols is usually of great importance to those who they belong, who identify themselves with such symbols. It is a subjective, sometimes very emotional issue, which is prone, or its use is prone to cause sometimes even great disturbances in any given society. By itself, it is very hard to define a symbol. As it is said, it is like an arrow that flies and does not fly, motionless yet uncatchable, visible but unattainable. When talking about symbols of national minorities and religious symbols, the emotional and subjective bond I mentioned, linked with the symbols, is even more important, as such symbols are used, among other uses, to preserve, mark, and extinguish the members of a national minority and or religious community. It is usually a part of their identity, of what they are. This is why such symbols are, if one should dare to say such thing, more important than other symbols. However, we live in a pluralistic society, and use of such symbols should usually not be prohibited or limited. But because of their potential to create strife in society, one would expect that they are rather strictly legally regulated. Namely, especially the use of religious symbols can be perceived by many, and this has been argued, as a means to assimilate those who do not belong to the majority in a given society. Furthermore, the use of symbols of national minorities, when taking into account their historical background, can also have the potential to create strife between minorities and the majority, as unfortunately we witnessed for a long time in Croatia. When we look at the legal regulation of symbols of national minorities in Croatia, we can observe that this regulation has a high level of regulation in the context of hierarchical position of the norms which regulate this issue. Firstly, the Constitution stipulates that everyone has equal rights, members of all national minorities and the majority. The freedom of the members of all national minorities to express their national affiliation, to use their language and script, and to exercise cultural autonomy is guaranteed. From this constitutional text, we can easily and clearly derive that national minorities are allowed to use their symbols, but that their use is regulated by another act, the Constitutional Act on the Rights of National Minorities. This act is an organic law according to the Constitution and must be adopted by a two-thirds majority of all members of Parliament. The Constitutional Act defines a majority as a group of Croatian nationals whose members are traditionally settled in the territory of the Republic of Croatia, and its members have ethnic, lingual, cultural, and or religious determinants different from other citizens, with a desire to preserve those determinants. Among the rights guaranteed by the Constitutional Act, we can highlight the use of language and script and the use of symbols. However, when taking account or talking about the legal regulation of symbols of national minorities, one should define what is a symbol. We can take the narrow definition and talk only about the flags, anthems, and cultural symbols. However, we can also talk and should talk about the use of language, and especially script, in our domestic circumstances. We should take into account some other forms of symbols of national minorities in the form of their well-known associations. Also, are the members of parliament elected in the minority quota also a symbol of national minorities on the highest level in the representative body or legislative body? Does this also apply to their representatives in the representative bodies of local self-government and in the executive branch of power on the local level? In this lecture, I opt for the broad definition of a symbol of a national minority. Therefore, the symbols I talk about, which can be linked with national minorities today are language, script, other symbols, and the now guaranteed seats in parliament and other representative bodies on the local level for the minorities. Of course, the use of language and script of national minorities is regulated by the Constitutional Act, and the use of language and script of national minorities in the Republic of Croatia Act. The regulation of official use of language and script of national minorities is rather extensive and rather clear. However, as we all are very well aware of, there are strong problems in practice. The use of symbols is also regulated by the Constitutional Act, which prescribes that the use of bearings and symbols of national minorities and the celebration of holidays of national minorities is allowed. The use of flags, anthems, and other symbols of national minorities is allowed, but with the use of symbols of the Republic of Croatia. And this is very interesting to say that on the regulatory plane, the right to reuse the symbols of national minorities, notwithstanding how we define them, is regulated and very well secured. It is very important to say that associations of national minorities can and are allowed to put the name of their founder, so the national minority, in their title, so they can also be perceived as a symbol of a national minority, and the Constitutional Act grants them national funding, which is also of significance. When we talk about their representatives, the Constitutional Act that is allowed by the Constitution, which stipulates that members of minorities can have a right to elect their representatives as a member of parliament on a special list, and that is done with the Constitutional Act, which guarantees 5 to 8 members of parliament, which are elected on a special minority quota. Also, the thing that they have representatives in parliament can be viewed in two meanings. First, as the symbol of the Republic of Croatia's commitment to protection of minorities, and secondly, as a symbol of the minorities they represent, and their value and importance in our society. So, we can choose in what manner to appreciate this obligation to give minorities guaranteed seats in the parliament. Also, in certain cases regarding, with regard to their quota in the general population, they have the right to be represented in the representative bodies of municipalities and counties. And if they have this right, they also have the right to be represented in the executive branch of the government also. So such members of representative and executive bodies can also be viewed as a symbol of the national minority and a clear sign of their existence and value in society. As we can see, rights of national minorities are regulated in detail with the basis of regulation in the Constitution and a very important constitutional act. So the reasons for such detailed and rather strict regulation are obviously political and with a significant historical context. But on the regulatory plane, the right to use the symbols of national minorities, notwithstanding how we define them, is regulated and secured. Of course, one must again stress out existing problems in practice. On the other hand, we have legal regulation of religious symbols, or we have religious symbols. Their presence or use in the public sphere is a question which is usually not governed by any specific regulation, as is stated in now famous and previously mentioned Lauzi versus Italy judgment of the European Court of Human Rights from 2011. However, the fact that there is usually no regulation of this matter does not mean that it is not a hotly disputed issue. Namely, this issue usually arises when talking about the presence of religious symbols in public schools or in public sphere. This question of presence of religious symbols in public schools has been brought before Supreme Courts of a significant member states of Council of Europe. And the European Court of Human Rights has stated that the presence of religious symbols in state schools is expressly forbidden only in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia today, Northern Macedonia, France, with the historical exemption of the regions of Alsace and Moselle, and Georgia. It is, on the other hand, expressly prescribed as permitted or obligatory in Italy, Austria, some German landers, some communes in Switzerland and in Poland. Nevertheless, such symbols are found in state schools in other countries in which there is no regulation of the matter, such as Spain, Greece, Ireland, Malta, San Marino, and Romania. Our neighbor Slovenia is among the states in which there is a direct prohibition of religious symbols in state schools. Its Education Act explicitly prohibits any religious activities in public schools. Not only that, it also prohibits any other kind of denominational activity in public schools and kindergartens. And with regard to other public spaces, there is no regulation as is usual in most European countries. So the question is, where does Croatia stand with this issue? When we look at the regulation regarding the use of religious symbols in the Republic of Croatia, we can only find one provision of the Constitution, which is connected to the issue, and Professor Koraškava has mentioned it, the Article 40, which prescribes the freedom of conscience and religion and the freedom to demonstrate religious or other convictions shall be guaranteed. This, of course, includes the right to demonstrate religious convictions by adequate symbols. However, the Constitution also prescribes in Article 41 that religious communities are separated from the state. Those are the only provisions one can find regarding the use of religious symbols in our legal order. Obviously, the question arises how to interpret Articles 40 and 41 of the Constitution, taking both into account. Of course, this question is valid only regarding the use of religious symbols in public institutions, not in all public spaces, or regarding private use of religious symbols. There is no special provision in our legislation regarding this issue. This, of course, creates problems with the use and or display of religious symbols, especially in public schools and institutions, as was already mentioned. However, in cases in which clear legal regulation is lacking, or like in the case of religious symbols just absent, one must turn to the relevant case law of the European Court for Human Rights and the Court of the European Union. Both courts dealt with this issue in their respective case law. The European Court of Human Rights stated in its Lauzi versus Italy judgment that the state does not have to be impartial in its approach to religious symbols. Namely, every state can have a closer relation with a specific religious community. Europe is full of such examples: Greece, United Kingdom, Denmark, Malta, etc. In the Lauzi judgment, the court stated that the cross in classrooms of public schools does not constitute a violation of the convention, but every state has to decide whether such approach applies to its constitutional order. So this is very important. So every case decides for itself with regard to its constitutional order whether the public display of religious symbols in public institutions is allowed or not. On the other hand, the court in Luxembourg is on the line with the display of religious symbols of employees can be prohibited by the employer under certain conditions. Very recently, in the decisions Babe and Müller-Handel from 2021, the court said if a worker is prohibited from wearing any visible sign of political, philosophical or religious beliefs in the workplace, that may be justified by the employer's desire to pursue a policy of political, philosophical and religious neutrality with regard to its customers or users, provided that certain preconditions are met. First, that the policy meets a genuine need on the part of that employer, which is for that employer to demonstrate, taking into consideration inter alia, the legitimate wishes of those customers or users and the adverse consequences that that employer would suffer in the absence of that policy, given the nature of its activities and the context in which they are carried out. Secondly, that the difference of treatment is appropriate for the purpose of ensuring that the employer's policy of neutrality is properly applied, which entails that that policy is pursued in a consistent and systematic manner. And thirdly, that the prohibition in question is limited to what is strictly necessary, having regard to the actual scale and severity of the adverse consequences that the employer is seeking to avoid by adopting that prohibition. So we see that the case law of the court in Strasbourg on this matter and the case law of the European Union's court in Luxembourg are very different. So there will be rather problematic issues in the future if both cases stand by its case law in the future. Therefore, one should conclude that although there is no legal regulation of use of religious symbols, there is the case law which allows for their use in public space, but according to the constitutional setup of a given state, and allows for their prohibition in business relations under certain conditions. Finally, it is clear that this subject is delicate. The use of all types of symbols is linked with strong impact on politics, emotions, and identity issues. Problems that arise from the suppression and or incitement of their use are prone to provoke strife in a given society and even violence, as various research has shown. In the Republic of Croatia, legal regulation of symbols of national minorities and religious symbols is very different. Legal regulation of symbols of national minorities is rather detailed and strict. It is a product of political and historical reasons. The regulation is such that there should be no problem in its implementation, but this is not the case rather often. On the other hand, the legal regulation of use of religious symbols is practically non-existent. However, there is the case law of Strasbourg and Luxembourg courts that is relevant for the Republic of Croatia as well in their scope of competence. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you to Professor Stanicic, who acknowledged us with legal ground and legal lacunas on the various very controversial issues in this society that will probably produce more questions, including the ones on the possibility whether it's on the legislative policy, just as it is with the religious symbols in civil law. Is it enough, or is there a judicial practice of the European Court and domestic courts enough to be as a regulatory framework? So I would say quite a lot of issues to discuss, to be discussed, and also most of them interrelated. I would now ask colleagues who already gave the papers to return back and to join the discussion, including Sasha.
George, this applies to you also.
And George, yes. Unfortunately, some colleagues need to their other duties. As you know, we have to.
Okay, so let me start with sociological observation. And my question actually, it's a sub-question that will lead to further maybe question. If there is a lack of legal regulation of religious symbol, is that a problem? Why is the problem? For whom is the problem? And the underlying question, okay, you can say something, but you can say later or whoever. But the underlying question is, what is the social issue? So what kind of, social processes we perceive as a social issue, which will be regulated, and which kind not, and why? What I can see, first, although we have some small cases and some small debates about crosses, something like that, they are not debated. They are not part of any kind of overall social discussion. On the other hand, we have some issues which are very much connected, and we were debated so much, and there were conflict about it. Religious education as such in the public school, prayer in the square, prayer in the front of the hospital. Not some of them are symbols, some of them are not, actually symbols, but are very much related. So the question is why we perceive some, events or symbols as a problem, and why we don't see some other as a problem. I have no answer, but also connected maybe act is that there is, the problem is how we perceive the things. So I think there is a difference in perceiving public space and public institution. One approach is the public institution, schools, prisons, army, hospitals, and another is what is happening in the public space. And what is happening in the public space actually, is something which is more debated or causes at the moment more division in the society. Very connected with that is religious freedom. The religious freedom as a notion, as a concept, was used very much by many religious communities during the communist time. If you read, Catholic papers from that time, if you see the statement of the Croatian of the Yugoslav Bishop Conference of that time, so religious freedom was used often as an argument. Today, religious freedom is not used as an argument. It's not important. The issue, the concept is not important. I see absence. I don't have a research, but what I'm trying to covering and to follow this issue. I don't see that this is used as a concept, which can advance or protect or do whatever if you want to talk about something. So just to give you illustration, Friday night we did very small scale limited research about the religion in prison. And we found out that no one cares about religion in prison. On the other hand, it's actually good regulated. And there is provision of religious freedom in prison, but no one cares about it. So this is not an issue. So really, I think our underlying question is, if it is social issue, how it is perceived, and then when we come to the legal regulations, I think we should really connect with that. And just final sentence, because Fran wanted to say something. Final sentence. Excuse me?
How do you know? How do you know to say something?
The final sentence is the lousy cases are obviously the most known, but there are some other similar cases in Europe, in European Union, but also outside Canada, for example, very famous cases. In these all cases, there is an argument that religious symbols are cultural and passive symbol. But this is happening, I think in the context in which the religion loses the ground, or in which secularization is going on more rapidly than is happening in the Croatian context. One of my colleagues from Spain called it ban on Catholicism. So Catholicism, which is here, but actually no one perceived as a religion anymore. It becomes part of the cultural history without or deploying religious meaning. I think the Catholicism, although there are much criticism about the church and church position, it's still very much embedded, I think, in the Croatian state. This this link is very strong, and that's why I think this interpretation of the cultural, symbolic, just historical, doesn't have ground, solid ground yet in Croatia. What will happen in the future, we will see, but at the moment, I don't see this kind of interpretation which can go on. That's just a few remarks.
So in order to answer some of the questions posed by Professor Zrinjak, one should say, firstly, why don't we have legal regulation of use of religious symbols? Precisely because of the reasons you mentioned, because they are mostly viewed as cultural and traditional, and we didn't have need to regulate them because of the way the people looked at them and perceived themselves as part of that community in which that is normal, and their public use was not controversial. But as you can see, this Lao case, of course, says the cross is a neutral symbol, it's a passive symbol. However, there is the very infamous, or famous as some would say, SIS versus France in 2014, in which the court established a new legal phrase in order to be able to say that the ban of, I will say burqa, but the law was not only for burqa, but for all manners of concealment of women. But it was all, we all know, and everyone knows that it is against burqa. So the living together legal notion. We need a society in which we need to live together, and in order to live together, we have to be able to see each other. That was the argument the European Court crafted in order to say that the ban of burqa is justified. Why? Why was that controversial all of a sudden? Because it is a symbol, burqa is a religious symbol, which is perceived as dangerous by the majority.
As political.
Yes.
As political.
And we do not have a legal regulation. And we do not want legal regulation. But sometimes, when a religious symbol is perceived as political, ideological, or dangerous, then we have ad hoc regulation just for specific religious symbols. But one should not mistake that the argumentation used in SIS versus France or other judgments of the European Court cannot be used against religious symbols that are now perceived as passive or non-dangerous or traditional in the future. So because things change, and a lot of lawyers and sociologists see this SIS versus France judgment of the European Court as very dangerous and and they say that it opened a door which should not have been opened. So I hope that I answered some of the questions you posed.
Can I just take the sentence, because there are different, also other judgments, and there are much criticism that there is, by the state and by the courts, definition of some religion as a culture or mainly culture, a definition of some religion as mainly political. So the state and the court redefine, it's, in the process of redefining the basic elements of religions, and which then influence, what we perceive as a symbol, how the symbol should be regulated. So it's, we have some cases which are interesting for us, but we have some cases interpretation which can be very, very good to say, very politically dangerous and socially sensitive, completely socially sensitive. So I wouldn't, follow all that. All of them, we are part of the Council of Europe, and the jurisprudence of the European Court is, instructive for us, and so on. But there are some socially very dangerous elements because they are imposing different interpretation to different religions without any substantial reason.
And when Madonna wears a cross, not to hide her religious feelings, or when a nun wears a cross, This is completely different cross. The same symbol, but it's also difficult and dangerous for a legislator, because if you start to legislate something, this also can diminish freedoms in a way. So maybe sometimes it's better to be trustful to judges, but as far as we know, our judiciary is not going better and better, but much more better and much. And, I mean,
no, I agree. It's better because many countries, they don't define religion. You know, they define religious communities. Also, our law doesn't define religious communities. So this is better not to define some notions or some concepts which are not easy to define. So there is a freedom of people to define on behalf of themselves what is religion and how they base their religious communities.
Your answer clarified to me a few questions that I had. So it's also not the only the answer to Sinisha, but also to some of my questions. But I would like to pose the very simple, perhaps laconic questions to both of you. If I properly understood, you would consider that the regulation on the issues that we have just discussed in Croatia is, in fact, satisfying.
Well, with regard to national minorities, the regulation is very satisfying on paper, of course.
Yeah, I mean religion, in fact.
But I believe that there is no need to strictly regulate the use of religious symbols, because that can put us on a very dangerous path. When who will decide which symbols are permissible and which are not? How will we decide? Based on which criteria? Which religious community will have the right to put their symbols in public spaces or public institutions, and which will not? When we will say that is enough, or how will we have to make room for all religious symbols of all recognized religious communities if they want to be put in the public spaces? Perhaps the now situation which we, in a nutshell, really don't have religious symbols in public spaces is maybe the best solution. So sometimes we do have them, but if we look around in our faculty, we will not find any religious symbols in any of our classrooms. In most public schools, you will not find religious symbols. So I find that is most satisfying, because the next step away, the Muslims will say we need the half moon, the Jews will say we need our yarmulke, someone will say we need all of the symbols Professor Korash showed, and we will not have the wall big enough to put all the symbols on it. So maybe this quiet solution is the best one, or that's my belief.
Does it in a way contradict to minor objections, as far as I could understand, from reviews from the Ombudsman of the Atheist Society, that demands the regulation on symbols in public spaces because they feel offended by, for example, unregulated, and because of that, rather deliberate, well, in a way, use of crosses in prisons, in hospitals, etc. Or on the other side, the perhaps expectancy of some other circles that, in regard to the broad cultural acception of Catholicism and Catholic symbols as widely accepted cultural national symbols in the broadest way, that they should be granted such position.
Well, when I said that there is the provision of the Constitution which states that the state and church are separated, and by putting any religious symbols of the state could be seen as bias toward a specific religious community, and some would argue that that would mean a breach of this provision of the Constitution. And
does it contribute to the contract with the Holy See, which explicitly, well, I quoted your book actually, that explicitly provided Catholicism as having a special role in the making a Croatian nation?
no. For example, the Constitution of Spain stipulates only Catholic Church from all other religious communities, but that does not mean that it is privileged in any manner, because that is a traditionalist way of things. The Catholic Church is, of course, most important religious community, and it has a certain level of rights, and it helped all others to achieve similar rights. As Professor Korzylov has mentioned, there is now 19, I think, religious communities with almost the same set of rights as the Catholic Church. But I believe that neutrality in this manner is the best solution. Of course, not with regard to all public spaces, because we have to distinguish public space, Professor Zicha said, public space and public institution. So public spaces are different things, and public institutions are schools, prisons, hospitals, or kindergartens, faculties, and so on and so on, theaters, and so on. So we should not talk about the regulation of use of religious symbols in public space, but we could talk about the regulation of religious symbols in public institutions. But I do not feel that we have a significant problem in order to solve it by legal regulation. So we probably create more problems with the attempt to create legal regulation regarding this issue, as that would divide the society broadly and could make a very broad crack in the nation. So why do it?
Sasha, agrees with that? Not quite.
I'm not sure by myself, so
It's a very difficult question, of course.
maybe I'm not objective, so I will remain quiet right now. Okay, but it's a political question, of course. That's why we are debating. So it is, if somebody is harmed by a cross in school, that's the concrete example I'm trying to imagine. There is a way to complain, and the problem might be solved. So there are also other wishes, maybe for the cross to be seen. If it is harming or not, it's for me quite. Maybe you could ask me if I would, what I would think if the director of the school would expose Half Moon. I try always to think like this. If I would be offended, me personally not, but maybe somebody would. So I think I wouldn't allow to say anything very smart, because I think I have to rethink this and make some more research just to be open. But if we talk about concrete case, if somebody is in concrete case, his or her religious feelings, then I would say yes, I would vote for non-pecuniary damage if this is appropriate to the case. So in this public sphere, I think it's mainly political questions. So I would like to see regulations are as I just now, not regulated. If something is not regulated, it is not bad. So you have freedom. So this is fine.
Okay. So well, please. More questions? to ask Georgia something that you already spoke about in this, yes, Sasha.
Good night, everybody.
Yes, we are. We can extend a little bit this discussion, I think, for a while. Even now we are at the end of our projected time. I would like to ask Georgia something that, in fact, he spoke in his paper. That I would like him asked to be more well, perhaps decisive. I mean, he's, so to say, the gustibus type of question. When he spoke about this double, in a way contradictory, in a way complementary. It depends the gustibus, the definition of the state. In Croatian case, the Croatian state as the nation state of the Croats, and the state of the rest. And this popular definition of the states and the community of citizens, which is present in all other former Yugoslav republics in this or that way, except Kosovo and Montenegro, because of political reasons. We can very easily presume why. And kind of inheritance of Leninistic. I don't think that everything Leninistic is so bad. It depends upon the context. But this obviously is the Leninistic tradition that was obviously because of some reasons in post-Yugoslav states. Now we are discussing the Croatian case with, so to say, reference to the other former Yugoslav states, most of them. Do you think it's good? In fact, you discussed the topic. Is it useful? For example, is it contradictory? Is it undermining from the constitutional point of view, the human rights, freedoms, and so on?
This distinction between the popular and ethnic causes, so to say. So it's not undermining. I mean, technically, if you take a look at the Constitution, the normative part, Article 1, gives a definition, which the popular sovereign defined on the basis of the death. Which does not mean that, I mean, who would deny that Croatia is the nation state of the Croatian people? Nobody would deny that. I don't deny that. Is there anybody who denies that? I mean, it is the nation state of the Croatian nation. The point being in the level of regulation, as I said, and as you said, in the, for me, central part of the paper, the point is that the lack of regulation in aspect of certain symbols is the result of the fact that the nation state as such provides for that protection through the majority system in the parliament. So there is no need for a special protection as it is the case in regards of, for instance, national minorities' rights. So I don't think that it's undermining. I mean, it can be combined. If you take a look at the German constitution, for instance, it talks largely about the German people at the beginning and the opening parts of the Constitution. German people, but then what continues is the list of rights, which is construed upon the concept of person as such, thence. I don't think that they are undermining, provided that everybody has the same rights in a balanced way. But I mean, the Constitutional Court, if you take a step further, if you take the practice of the Constitutional Court, which was actually and is still creating this notion of constitutional identity, the court gradually, step by step, incorporates several parts of the Constitution into the concept of constitutional identity, among which, of course, is also the notion of the nation state, as well as the position of national minorities, so equally. I don't think that there is seriously a danger nowadays, but you are the lawyer in national history and the expert before me, you know better. But I don't think that there nowadays exists a real danger of jeopardizing the position of the national majority in Croatia, as it may have existed throughout history. Philosophically, it's the question of us against them. I see that everywhere I go, us against them. I could understand that this existed throughout the history, from Pacta Conventa actually. And our fellow European citizens, Hungarians, would know better, I hope would know better than others about this, because we were in the Union for 800 years. So for much of the history it was Hungarians and Croatians, and then the Austrians, and then the Serbs and so on. But now we are independent. So the similar type of question that was posed in the 19th century planetarium, I don't expect to be posed now. We have the state. The state, which is part of the European Union, which is another separate question. Right? So, but I don't find persuasive this argument that similar dangers, politically, socially, culturally, wherever, exist today as they existed before. Therefore, I don't find objectionable this twofold definition of the nation state at the same time, and democratic definition of people in the Constitution. Although I, for the reasons that I hope I gave before, I strongly believe that the Demos concept is prevailing. And there is a reason that it is in the normative part of the Constitution, not just in the preamble. It is. The normative part of the Constitution, moreover, is really full of references to national origin in the ethnic sense of the word. You have, like, for instance, the reference to the members of the Croatian people living abroad, which deserves some respect and attention and assistance from the Croatian state. So the diaspora has 3 seats reserved in the Croatian parliament. National minorities, I agree with what Rade said before. National minority representatives in the parliament are one of the symbols of the national identity of those minorities. Definitely, they are. Very, very, very distinctive. On the other hand, the situation there is quite satisfactory. I don't agree. Typically, if I argue for the Demos concept, then I would say no need for representatives of national minorities. That would be ideal, and there would be no problems. Everybody would be seen, perceived as citizens. No need to provide for special protection of national minorities within the parliamentary system. There will be okay. There will be okay. There are reasons why we pursue this idea of fixed seats for history, recent history. And unfortunately for the problems that we face now, related to hate speech. That's what I perceive, what Alexander was talking about, actually. But I would personally like to have all these specific arrangements removed from the Constitution. Okay, we have general seats. I mean, everybody is a citizen, that's okay. But the situation there, if you go into detail, is satisfactory. It's not. Where is not the situation satisfactory? Take a look at this group of representatives in the parliament which represent the nations of the former Yugoslavia, apart from Serbs. Serbs are distinguished as being put into the first category. They have 3 representatives. Although, according to the proportionality requirements, their participation in population 3 is even less than they deserve. They have fixed, so that's a balance because they have fixed seats, but that's not proportional to their actual number. But okay, leave that aside. Go to the second last category. Peoples, the minorities belong to peoples of the former Yugoslavia, plus Albanians, minus Serbs. Okay, so Montenegrins, Albanians, Macedonians, Slovenians, Bosnians. Montenegrins, Macedonians, Slovenians never get their representative. Why? Because they are outnumbered. What is the reason for having such a combination in one category? No reason. They have a right to participate. Their member will never be a member of the parliament, ethnically speaking, nationally speaking. For Czechs and Slovaks, my colleague very funnily observed several years ago that Slovaks and Czechs separated in 1991. Still, we have Czechs and Slovaks in the same category for the election of their representatives in the parliament. So, but okay, these are minor major problems emerge from cases like the 2018 popular referendum initiative that I mentioned, 2014 popular referendum initiative, and practically, I mean, very well solved case of the electoral law in 2011 by the Constitutional Court. So again, I don't see the problem in having those two definitions within the Constitution. That's a common ground for other constitutions as well. But I believe, and normatively speaking, argue in favor of the demos concept and emphasize once again that this is the fact of the Croatian Constitution because it's in the normative part of the Constitution, Article 1, norm. Preamble is another thing, norm. Even though through the incorporation process, the case law of the Constitutional Court, as I said, even the national concept of sovereignty becomes part of the constitutional identity of the Croatian state. So that would, in practice, actually mean that there could be no measure adopted against the Croatian majority as well. That is a strong barrier. Okay? At the expense of the Croatian majority, you cannot go in furthering the claims of the minority. That is the balance. I find that so far so good, quite suitable. And there is one technical detail, if I may add, that you mentioned, Professor Cepulo, in your paper, related to the constitutional law, the rights of national minorities, and the Vukovar case, 2014, Article 8. Article 8 of the constitutional law actually prescribes that those rights which are given to minorities, right, should be applied in a manner that is not inconsistent with the interests of the majority. I mean, yes. Who wouldn't agree with that? That's what I just said. Although I believe, and you know who was using, I mean, there are certain political groups in our society which use Article 8 specifically. Of course, such a balance must exist. National minorities must not jeopardize the position of the majority, if they can. I don't know that they can, especially now in Croatia, they cannot. But, okay, normatively, let's say that they cannot in any way legally. Just as the majority cannot be in a position to jeopardize the position of the minority. But the problem is this: such a norm does not exist, does not belong to the law as a special norm. It is a part of the law-making process. Once you make a law, you take account of that. How much you give to the minorities, that's the process of the law-making. Not as a special provision within the law. Why? Because once you have Article 8 in the law, that means that in certain cases you can actually suspend provisions of that law according to the case basis. And that is the problem. That's what you have in the Vukovar case. In the Vukovar case, you have this. We will, at the end of the opinion in 2014, the Constitutional Court, which gave a good decision, extremely good. At the end of the case, it said, okay, but let's take a halt. This is a serious situation, which is. Nobody argues that it's not. But let's suspend the rights that belong to minorities for some time, and then let's re-evaluate them for within certain periods. Okay. I mean, that should have been taken into account when the law was adopted. Will you give them those rights or not? This way we have a situation, a scenario in which you suspend some part of the law. And what you have now is the following. At that time, script and language of the national minority was not in public use in Vukovar because of the conditions, of the circumstances, which we all know. Unfortunate, burdening, bad. I mean, without any doubt. But the law was suspended, actually, even though the minority fulfilled the condition of having 1/3 of the population there. Now that that number has fallen, according to the last census, they lost that right. But you know, the lay person, not lawyers, lay person sometimes give the best account of what the situation is. When I was talking to a lay person recently about that phenomenon, the conclusion was this. when the law had to be applied, it was not applied. Now that it doesn't have to be applied, it will be applied. That is the outcome. And these are the problems. So I don't see a problem in combining national and ethnic on one hand and the democratic concept on the other. But the situation in Croatia today is quite different from what we had in the 19th and 12th century and before.
Yes, I agree with you. I think that the Croatian constitution is a good pragmatic combination, given historical circumstances, as a solution of the basic solution of the normative the normative constituency of the society. I would. So you are basically in favor of the state. I got an impression. I agree with you. I have an impression that this is not completely shared by most of the international, Western constitutional lawyers. This could be, for example, I would say, seen in Kosovo constitution, where this concept is completely absent, even though one could expect it. But of course, it's probably not Albanians that were writing the Kosovo constitution, but the international community. And also, it's interesting that Croatia has that special, I think, Article 10, that provides for special care for Croatian people abroad, which I see as a consequence of this preamble. But in Kosovo, they have similar provision, except that it does not refer to Albanians, but to the citizens of Kosovo. So they have this demos concept very consequently applied, and do not present Kosovo and Montenegro, probably because of completely other historical and political reasons, as in fact nation state, but as a multicultural state. I myself think that this solution is in fact, in the post-Yugoslav historical circumstances, quite a good solution. It's probably not very consequent. I think that Professor Jovic from political science is a very sharp critic of this concept, including the label Leninistic, etc. But so what? the cat that eats mice says it's not important. Is it black or white, or is it Leninistic or Wilsonian? It's important that it regulates the things good. Yes, we crossed our borders of discussion. I think it was very interesting. I think the contributions were very interesting. I learned a lot. I really learned a lot. I hope it goes for the other colleagues as well. Our colleagues had to move. Professor Mashalevsky also disappeared. He has, I think, he's sick and he also has children. Oh, there he is. Yes, yes. I would just ask him a very short question that, in fact, complies, I would say, with this discourse. You know that I was very interested in the disappearance of there was in the old criminal law, there was a special protection of the dignity of the Croatian people. This category disappeared in the new criminal law, the novel of it, and it, just as it probably complies to what Fran said, and it probably obviously, did not make any problems in expert community of experts, or even in broader community. Am I right?
Yes, so as you could see from my presentation, when it comes to symbols, there's equal protection, so there are same punishments when it comes to Croatian symbols or symbols of any other state or nation. So in this way, we could even put it in the same criminal offense, like Croatian flag or any other flag, but the thing is that as we have the chapter in the criminal code on crimes against Croatian state, then we had to separate the offenses. So when it came to hate speech and so incitement to hatred and violence as a crime in the Croatian criminal code, we didn't see need anymore to have a separate protection of Croats. As I said, they're also protected under these criminal offenses. So it's not just for minorities, but also the majority, although they're not really designed for a majority. It's more like, especially when it comes to incitement to violence and hatred, it's not very likely that a minority would attack a majority, but in, of course, multi-ethnic areas in Croatia where you have other minorities living together with the Croatian, maybe Croatians could be even a minority in some areas. So there it is possible, of course, to have these offenses, and the Croats can be vulnerable theoretically in these areas as well. So the idea is to equally protect, of course, to allow a greater freedom of speech. So if it's not insulting or humiliation of Croats, but that is not going to cause any violence or hatred against them, then it's not relevant. So it's not relevant for criminal liability. Individuals can be offended and they can have lawsuits on their own, but this is not something that the criminal code should deal with unless it fulfills this requirement, as I said, of instigating violence or hatred against a particular nation.
Thank you. Okay, to be honest, I do not have a question for colleague Kevin because everything was so clear. In shock, I was just glad that he reminded us of part of Croatian tradition from Austria-Hungary that is, I think, quite sometimes forgotten in discourses, and that is bidimensional, I would say, part of Croatian political culture, part of it, well, with operations, and that is the dimension of ethnic, national focus, because of obvious reasons, in the 19th century nation building century, proving itself as a separate, distinctive nation, but at the same time, this multicultural experience of Austro-Hungarian monarchy, in which this Croatian nation was part of multicultural framework that reflected to not isolation, but incorporation. And this, I think, is quite a benefit that should be, I would say, grown out. Also, it's very interesting. I would say that this is pretty much because we have in Budapest the discussions, and what I saw we did not come to the comparison, to the comparative regulation. This national dimension is much more present, not just in Hungary, but also in Serbia, etc. And with all of this that was very diminished in your speeches is much more protected, as far as I could understood, in some of our neighboring countries. Also, the approach to these, but not always legal, but cultural issues of cultural identity, forget the Croats as in fact, not a melting pot, but a country in which the Croatian identity is not purely, strictly opposed to other identities. Well, some of the leaders of the Croatian Nationalistic Party, I remember that their family name was Maša or Srb. I would say it speaks enough. Okay, thank you very much for your participation. We had crossed, as it might be expected, the time limits, but I think this was quite a good workshop. And it will be published, publicized in the respective Hungarian side and also at the side of our chair. Thank you very much.